project is being broken into 2 phases. So what I'm going to be talking about today will be the first phase. And the first phase is really a visioning and strategic planning process. And we'll be looking at enhanced opportunities for people to walk, bike, and use transit. And we're really looking at the corridor as a transportation route. We understand that it does other things. It provides recreation and opportunity to be near nature and things like that, but we're looking at it as a transportation route. We'll also be looking at some of the opportunities and challenges of redeveloping in a post-fire landscape and evaluating increased housing opportunities, especially and housing opportunities and types, especially affordable housing types, and mixed use, which enhances walkability. And then there's an element of developing some design and other suggestions for placemaking in the City of Talent and the City of Phoenix. And then the second phase will really get into the details of those code amendments and if necessary, plan amendments needed to support the code amendments. So that portion will occur in phase 2. And I can talk a little, I guess Stephen later will be talking about the involvement aspects. Okay.
Yeah, we'll get into the community kind of input parts in just a bit. Thank you, Laura, and welcome. Yeah, this is an amazing opportunity that we have, right, with the fire coming through and then the TGM study going on and the Greenway revisioning. You know, it's all running in parallel. It's all kind of reset in a certain horrible way. And so, you know, this is a real moment in our community. So thank you for all gathering to talk about it. Next is Bethany Martin from Urban Design Associates. Will you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Like Stephen said, my name is Bethany Martin. I work predominantly as a community engagement director, but also as a resiliency planner at Urban Design Associates. We're a Pittsburgh-based urban design and planning firm. And kind of most connected to this issue, we were responsible for the long-term community recovery planning process that took place in Paradise, California, following the Camp Fire in 2018. And just in general, do a lot of community-led engagement and design work. So I won't say I'm excited to be here because these are never fun and exciting things, but excited to brainstorm and share ideas about what can happen here post-disaster.
Great, thank you. Welcome, Bethany. And next we have Mr. Bob Hackett.
Hi, everybody. I know some of you. I'm happy to see so many new people. I am Bob Hackett. I'm the Executive Director of Travel Southern Oregon, and we are the regional tourism office for the state of Oregon. And so Jackson County, Josephine County, Douglas, Klamath, and Lake County are where I work as a liaison between the state tourism office and the local DMOs, the Travel Medfords, Travel Ashlands of the world. As I'll share later, Stephen and I have known each other for a long time. Stephen knows, you know, sort of the scope of the work that we do on the tourism side. And he very correctly, intuited that there is a connect here, and I'll share more about that later, about the vision, values, and strategic plan for the state tourism industry as it regards projects like this project that you're all working on. And so, thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Bob. And finally, Karen Wheeler-Clay of the LTRG.
Thank you. I am the Executive Director for the Jackson County Community Long-Term Recovery Group, and I am joining today because I'm incredibly interested in how these sort of planning processes can dovetail to sort of help us think about our recovery in the long-range future forward efforts. So how do we prioritize our survivors in the immediacy, but also have a community that is more robust and resilient? So mitigating hazards as well as creating livable spaces for wherever our survivors land, because we know that there's sort of a post-disaster diaspora, and we want to make sure that we are keeping that central into the processes that we oversee as the LTRG.
Great, welcome, Karen. I'm going to show a slide quickly just to kind of give a little bit of an idea of the scope of these various projects and how they overlap. And it may help kind of create an image in our minds as we're discussing all of this. So if you can see this, this slide, you know, the green square is all of Jackson County. The TGM process is really happening just along State Route 99 through from kind of the edge of Ashland through to South Medford. The Greenway project, of course, is longer, goes all the way up into Central Point. I should have extended that a little bit. And then the community recovery plan, which is kind of on the list of things to consider for Karen and for Bethany, right? That would cover the entire area. That would cover the entire county. So I'll stop sharing here. So I want to open up the floor to each of our guests, and I think we can go in the same order. And so Steve, you gave us a pretty good overview of what's in and what's out of the Greenway project. Any color you want to add there? And we'll go then to each guest. And this might be a good time to present any slides that you have, just to kind of give us a sense of what you're working on.
Well, yeah, I don't have any slides to share. What we're working on is kind of like I talked about in the beginning there, Stephen, is just trying to get a sense for what the community would like to see moving forward on the Greenway, what land managers would like to see, the best governance and funding kind of mechanisms moving forward. And like I kind of alluded to, what are the impediments for folks currently using the Greenway? We've never really looked at it from a complete kind of disciplinary approach. Natural Resources has been looking at it in their bucket, fire and fuel, law enforcement, recreation. This is an opportunity for us all to get together, look at how we manage the Greenway and how we develop the Greenway moving forward with all four of those buckets. And as Bob mentioned, the economic development end of things, there's a huge tourism link to the Greenway as it connects all the communities in the Bear Creek Valley. So bringing the economic development folks like Soretti and some of these other folks into the discussion and talking about, you know, the benefits of the Greenway, especially the benefits of the Greenway if it was managed to kind of the expectations of the community. And we had a governance structure set up that met those expectations and what the potential is. Right now, I think a lot of folks drive on I-5 and look down at the Greenway from Medford because that's really the most visible section of the Greenway. And they think that's what the entire 20 plus miles of the trail is, how it's represented per se, with the exception that the southern portions of the Greenway and the northern portions of the Greenway are a totally different user experience. So trying to really kind of change the perception of it through meeting community expectations is going to be key moving forward. I wish we did have Bob in the beginning and his marketing expertise to not unfortunately have revisioning in both Laura's project and our project, because I think it's confusing to the public to realize that they're two totally different projects. That being said, they do dovetail very closely together. So we're working closely with Laura and her team. We currently have a contractor, Alta Planning and Design. We put together a scoring committee back in September. We issued a request for proposals, received, I think, 4 or 5 proposals. We have a project scoring committee that's made up of elected officials from all 5 cities the trail goes through, from Ashland to Central Point. The county commissioner daughter is on that committee, and then also staff members from each of those. So it's generally speaking, it's the Parks and Recreation director from each of those 5 cities. And then we also have representation from ODOT as well. We're really making a concerted effort towards making this as inclusive of a project as possible, moving forward with jurisdictional representation, but more importantly from the public. So one of the things that Alta is currently working on, we just got them under contract, I believe it was in late December, January. So this project is kind of in its infancy, but one of the things that they're currently working on is developing a public outreach plan to be able to reach the public in this hopefully post-pandemic era moving forward. Most of it will be via Zoom or virtual open houses where the public can provide input on the process and current impediments. And then also they're developing an equity analysis really to start looking at, in the communities along the Bear Creek Greenway, what are some of the unique impediments for folks in our marginalized communities that may be keeping them from using that facility as well. So trying to do it in a unique way to reach as most of our citizens here in the county as we possibly can, while looking at some non-traditional forms of outreach and communication.
That's great. Great. And then Laura, let's hear from you in terms of, and maybe if you can give us a little bit of flavor around the outreach opportunity, the public input opportunities as well. That'd be cool.
Yeah, so I'll just share this slide. I tried to take basically what was in the statement of work and break it into, so is that showing sort of the whole slide?
Yes.
Okay.
So
So this is like a major boiling down of what's in the statement of work. And I broke it into two sections, some of the groups that are scoped and then some of the tasks that are scoped. And this is just the one, these are just the things that have to do with public involvement, not like the actual, memos and all of that sort of thing. And I will note that in addition to these groups, there's also a project management team, which is made up of state staff from DLCD and ODOT, and then staff from each of the local jurisdictions that fall into the project area, and that's the City of Phoenix, City of Talent, and Jackson County. And so the groups that are scoped, there's a project advisory committee, and this group is mostly intended to give technical and policy advice. Probably most of the people on that committee will be staff from local governmental or non-governmental organizations. And these will typically be people who are participating as part of their job. Then there's also sorry, it's asking me to turn on subtitles. So there's also a citizen advisory committee, and this is using the broad term, and now it's doing subtitles. I don't know. Okay. This is the broadest definition of citizen as reflected in our Oregon State Planning Goal 1, citizen involvement. So this is input from local residents, including, and this is specified in the statement of work, including displaced residents. And the group is scoped to reflect the demographic composition of the area pre-fire. So this will be a group that is put together, and there's more detail about who we're looking for in the statement of work. So it's a wide range of people living in different circumstances, people who might be transit dependent or not use a car to get around, people of different income levels, different demographics. It's intended to be as broad as possible. And then there's a stakeholder group, and the stakeholders don't meet together. They just have interviews, and they also are scoped to represent a very wide range of interests and people. And I'd be happy to go into more detail if somebody wants more detail about how those tasks were written or how the groups were described in the statement of work. So those are the groups related to participation from the community. And then there are a number of tasks, and I want to highlight the first one, the public involvement plan. Similar to Steve's project, this is where a lot of detail will be added to the activities that are already scoped. So there are a lot of aspects of public involvement that have not been defined yet and won't be defined until the project starts. And I know that Stephen was looking for opportunities for where the community could participate. And I would say this is a very excellent first opportunity, because this is what then defines all the things that are done to get the community to participate. So this would be an item that if people are interested in the public involvement activities throughout the project, you'd want to read this and weigh in on it. And actually, that's a good segue to the next item. So there's also an interested parties list that will be created and maintained and grow. And all of those people will be included in outreach with, emails and whatnot. There's also a website, and there will be a contact opportunity on the website where you can give feedback or input or ask questions. And this is where something like, for example, the public involvement plan would be posted with a notice about that we were seeking comments on it and that we wanted to get comments by a certain date. And emails would go out to everybody on the interested parties list to let them know about that. Of course, these are very early tasks, so hopefully we'll put together a pretty good interested parties list. I think we've already been talking to enough people that we probably have quite a lot of emails we can put on there. Then other involvement tasks are the PAC and CAC meetings. There are several of them throughout the phase 1 of the project. There are also the stakeholder interviews. And then sort of the big public event for this phase, now remember this is just phase 1, is a placemaking workshop. And because of COVID and the uncertainty around all of that, all of this is designed to be online. We've written in some accommodations for people who don't have computers and need to go somewhere to use a computer. So we've definitely taken that into account, but this is mostly online. And so there are 2 workshops for this placemaking workshop. One is specifically for the CAC, and then the other is geared toward the general public. So that's going to be one where we'll want to have a lot of outreach and make sure that a lot of people hear about it. So that's all. Are there any questions?
I've got a couple questions in terms of the public involvement plan. I'm subscribed to a couple of DLCD lists, where you can sign up per project or per subject area. Is that already posted on that area of the DLCD? Okay.
No, and so because TGM is its own thing, we actually don't post to our projects to those lists. That might be a good idea. That might be something that we should probably do. I'll need to talk to in fact, I don't even know who puts those together. I'll have to talk to some people and see about getting on some of those lists. But yeah, we typically don't cross publish. We do have our own TGM list, but we don't usually publish about specific projects for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so maybe we have a variety of communication channels here in the community that have developed, out of the fire recovery, and so we may be able to help get word out so that people who are interested can get onto the list to be notified, right? Because that's so often one of the impediments, is that normal citizens with their heads down living their lives are not even aware that the meeting's upcoming, or
no, they're not, and often they need to be reminded multiple times. I mean, I know that just from my own life.
Yeah, so Tucker is the chair of our the long-term recovery group's communications committee. So Tucker, what's your thought?
My thought is, Laura, I can't wait to meet with you on Thursday or Friday, but whenever we've scheduled that. But I just wanted to mention this because I know we're talking about a number of plans here, a number of different planning initiatives, and I just wanted to just mention that, we're very interested in supporting one or more or all of these planning projects with capacity. And we do have, some funding earmarked to do that through Oregon Community Foundation. That can include anything from, community engagement platforms to actual advertising dollars, and just possible ways to incentivize participation from the public with go bags or gift cards to fire affected businesses or any number of ways. So I just, I know I'm going to be talking to Laura and her team a little bit about TGM, but I just want to extend that as well to the county and of course the LTRG. They know they have that, and just make that offer. So just as we go through these projects, just know that's on the table if anyone feels interested in reaching out.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you, Tucker, and I'm sure we'll be talking more about that.
Yeah, I'd just say thank you to Tucker for that, because it's sometimes as hot of a topic as some of these topics are right now, it's sometimes really hard to get folks to engage. And for this project that we're working on specifically with the Bear Creek Greenway, it definitely needs a robust amount of community engagement. So any help that we can get in that will be key. So I'll certainly be reaching out to you.
And I see Kathy Bryan has her hand up.
I do. Thanks for calling on me. I guess I want to just suggest to both to Laura and to Steve that the use of focus groups, particularly bilingual focus groups or in Spanish only, using the organizations that have been working directly with families and or individuals that speak Spanish as their first language, would be really helpful to both of yours. And I know that early on, Laura in particular, the TGM interest at the very beginning, before it was even applied for, was to engage the community in appropriate ways, meaning the whole community, the seniors, disabled individuals. And so the neighborhood captains that Tucker's speaking of could be one avenue of that. And then maybe doing focus groups where stipends are help assist people one get there and feel like their information counts, would be another way to make sure that we meet that interest that you both have. And do it from the onset so that we're not kind of after the fact saying, oh, but we didn't hear from X, Y, and Z. There are nodes of connections, and I know Erica could be really helpful with that as well. So
yeah, thank you, Kathy. That was definitely something that we tried to infuse throughout the statement of work, and we did specifically call out levels of participation as defined by the International Association for Public Participation. So that's very well defined what level we're striving for and what things need to be done to achieve it. The CAC is an area where we would have a lot of that representation. We don't have any meetings scoped with specific groups separately. But one of the benefits of having this be a two-phased project is that if there are areas that, throughout this first phase, we find that, we needed to talk with this group or we needed to have different tasks, then we can certainly write that into the second phase. I mean, definitely the lessons learned, which there are always lessons learned, will be incorporated into the second phase.
I'm wondering if it might be helpful that some of the community part, like I said, could be shared between like the community, like through all three circles or all three geographic areas that Stephen outlined in that photograph, so that instead of people being asked 3 times for 3 overlapping issues, that there could be an attempt made, and that could be part of the community work that Karen's leading or would like to see led. I'm not sure if UDA is going to do that or who's going to do that, but just seems like, if we could kind of draw it together, that would be the best use of people's time and inform all 3 circles, or not circles, but
Yeah, so we don't actually have any meetings that are divided out by jurisdiction. They're all project meetings with one exception. And that's that at the end of phase 1, we'll be meeting with each of the local jurisdiction leaders, and those are their local governments. So we, can't have them really all come together, but all of the, what I would call public or stakeholder participation is on a project level. It's not split out by jurisdiction.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if that's what you meant.
The other thing that I would add to that is I think all of our projects are going on generally at the same time, but they're getting started at different times, right? So there's different opportunities for input for, you know, when the Greenway revisioning plan, for example, might have an open house posted for a 2-week period for public comment, might not align when the DLCD project does. So I would be very interested in reaching out to anybody on the call who wants to help with that public outreach to get the word out on an individual project basis. But I would be a little concerned drawing all the projects together.
The invoice
I
for
think
it
it might
or find where it's
confuse
still there's a backup, but
Yeah, no, I wasn't suggesting trying to get everyone all together in the same place. I was more kind of like, how could we gather information that would have benefit for all three of those?
Okay.
All three of those circles or whatever they are.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm missing words today. I apologize.
And Stephen, just an FYI, I did, I figured you would ask me later, but I'll throw it in for you now, that we do have a community advisory committee that we're compiling to get citizen input, and a technical advisory committee. The technical advisory committee really is kind of the fire, fuel, law enforcement, natural resource and so ready folks in the community. I did ask Kathy if she was interested in sitting on the community advisory committee, and she said yes, just about a half hour before this call. So good input already, Kathy.
Great, thank you, Steve. And Laura, I want to go back to you. This has turned into a really interesting nexus of conversation here. Laura, do you have anything more you'd like to add in terms of your kind of introducing your project?
No, I don't think so. Just addressing any questions. And I think Erica had a question. I don't know if she's still.
Yeah, she lowered her hand, but Erica, you of course have the floor whenever you would like it. And I see in the chat there's conversation around pulling together a calendar. I would love to do that, and I think that's a really interesting role for the long-term recovery group to do, is to pull a calendar together of all of these opportunities, and that so people have one place they can go and see everything that's everywhere they can get input. Gary, do you have a quick question? You're muted, Gary. Gary, you're muted.
That better? Yes. So I'll try and make it quick. I listening to Kathy and reading between the lines, I kind of feel that rather than, as she said, that she wasn't necessarily expecting all people to be in one place to talk about everything, but more that those polygons is a good word to describe what was on that description that which you had, that all of those things are integrated, that the specific projects have ties to everything else that's going on. And so a way of getting input that approaches the connections between those different projects to create the outcome that you're after is to have basically have a mechanism that allows for cross flow between those projects, not keeping you, because otherwise you have a tendency to be in your silo. And when you're in your silo, you tend to ignore the things or not because you've got enough to do to get your job done. And a way to get around that is in that the citizen advisory aspect of, or the project advisory, is to have that cross-fertilization so that your project is integrated with the things that you're not dealing with directly. And another way to do that is to have a vision of the whole thing. And I realize that's not necessarily easy, but it is important. I'll stop right there.
Gary, that's perfect. That's absolutely glorious. Could not have designed a better segue to our friend Bethany Martin, who did just that in Paradise.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll throw these up. There's a dozen or so, but we don't have to go through all of them by any means in detail. But yeah, so we did the long-term recovery planning process in Paradise, and since then have also worked on a handful of other communities stricken by various degrees of disaster. Right now, we are working in Southwest Louisiana in 2 parishes that were devastated by Hurricanes Laura and Delta. And we are also in Minneapolis on Lake Street working on a strategic corridor planning effort around the devastation experienced from the civil unrest following George Floyd's murder in 2020. And so, regardless of the disaster that people are experiencing, there is this necessity behind community-based visioning and how we gather everyone together post-disaster to both come up with immediate solutions to problems they're facing on a day-to-day basis, and also to vision for an improved future for their community. And so, like I said, we'll go through these quickly. There's just a handful of examples. The town of Paradise was the entity responsible for the long-term recovery group. However, when we think about all of these supporting organizations, these were not just folks who participated in a community engagement process, but these were also the folks who were taking responsibility for their recovery projects. They were leading various efforts in their community, and all of these things were happening at the same time. And so the output of the long-term planning process in Paradise was this set of 50 different recovery projects. So this is the place when you start to look at the Greenway project or the Highway 99 project. Those are things that would have plugged into the long-term recovery planning process in Paradise. So the equivalent to those kinds of things there were massive infrastructure projects. There were things associated with creating trails and networks for people to get around the town. And all of the community input is what ultimately resulted in these 50 projects. Visioning what that looks like in the future. So it's something as simple as a trail system, if it is made wide enough on main roads, can also serve as emergency evacuation routes if there are downed trees in major roads as you're trying to drive and evacuate out of town. And so what happened ultimately is, as we go through this process, which was about 6 months of intensive planning, they've had the last 2.5 years to begin implementing all of these projects. And we are actually back in Paradise currently revisioning their long-term recovery plan, because about 35% of it is already implemented in the last 2.5 years. And so they're already looking at, okay, we've done all of this. What can we do next to get going? And so these numbers are already out of date, but in a town where several thousand structures were devastated, they've already received over 2,000 permits for rebuilding homes, and over 1,200 of those are rebuilt today. And so it's an extremely quick turnaround process, but in this, it was vital that both the town and all of these private nonprofit development entities were all involved together, because it meant that, you know, of these recovery projects, about 60% of them were owned by town leadership to implement, and the other 40% were owned by the public in some capacity. So local foundations, local affordable housing developers, et cetera, responsible for taking those on. And so now, as we're looking at updating the recovery plan, you're looking at both talking to town leadership to understand what they have done as far as infrastructure, sewer, water, et cetera, has all been completed. But you're also talking to private entities like the Gold Nugget Museum, who were trying to rebuild after they were devastated. Or what does the local school system look like these days? Because so many of the students have had to be bussed out to other communities to actually be able to have school when the schools were destroyed as a part of the fire. And so, maybe speaking specifically on the engagement side of what this exactly looks like, this is some of the numbers we're currently looking at for phase 1 in our Southwest Louisiana process. And something that's important when you look at that kind of rainbow list of colors there on the left, we have explored every engagement tool in the toolkit in order to meet people where they are, because ultimately at the beginning of any of these processes, you have to identify what the barriers to engagement are and find the tool that meets that need or bridges the gap to that barrier. And so if it is concerns with underrepresentation from minority populations, it's identifying leaders within those populations who will serve as community liaisons and who have active and high positioned roles in the engagement process. So it's not just about how many of a minority population can I get into the room. It's at what level are their voices being empowered as a part of the process, to ensure that if you're having citizen advisory committees and representational groups, that they are at every facet of those conversations, not just, we held a Spanish speaking meeting, that's great, we met our quota. It means that those people are involved in every step of the process, because ultimately that means there's ownership at the same time. I don't live in your community. And so ultimately I can follow along as best as I would like post disaster, but you all live in this community, you do life here. Whether it doesn't matter who you are or what part of the community you live in, you are the ones who will ultimately take ownership over this process. And so that means that you have to feel as if you've had a vested interest. And so, you know, when you look at all of these tools, Hello Lamppost is a text-based survey. It's like somebody might have 5 minutes while they're picking their kids up at the school, whereas somebody else might have an hour at the end of their workday to attend a public meeting. And so it's ensuring that those community engagement methods actually meet people where they are. And then what this has resulted in is you see, I personally have read the over 4,000 comments for this process. And so this is just a very small snippet of what the folks had to say about the future of their community. And we turned these statements into specific action items associated with each of the project area topics. This is a 50-year vision plan. And so it's divided into these kind of 5 buckets. And ultimately these 5 overarching statements. And kind of from this, we are currently pulling projects, pulling implementation steps, pulling action items associated with what needs to be done in order to make Southwest Louisiana resilient for 50 years and beyond. But we can draw an exact line from the comment that Kathy, you might share in a public meeting, and how that has ended up at the vision statement that is guiding this process in whole. And we have done this with minority populations as well. So there were lots of low-income folks in Paradise that we engaged in this process. And that means looking at meeting times that fit them best, based around maybe some non-traditional work schedules. In Southwest Louisiana, we are working in a 2-parish region that is massive. And so it means that public meetings have to be hosted in 3 different locations, with signs all up around the community. And on Lake Street, something that's extremely unique to this area of Minneapolis is that everything that was devastated by the civil unrest were all small minority owned businesses of various backgrounds. And these are also the folks who are largely disinvested in, they are largely marginalized, they have no access to the resources necessary to figure out how to rebuild. And so while Target has done just fine rebuilding on Lake Street, you have a small Somali business next door who's like, apparently I could have been grandfathered into something, but I'm just worried about the fact that the minute I put a new door up, it's immediately vandalized again. And so for this process, you know, this group of people that recently participated in one of our 4 design workshops represents several facets of the community. And this meant that each one of these organizations had one-on-one conversations involved with them. So sometimes it's bringing everyone into a room and offering translation as a part of a public meeting. And in other cases, it was, I'm going to sit down and have a conversation with you for 20 minutes. And I just want you to tell me what is going on, what has happened, where are you struggling the most right now? Because if I come into this and tell you that I have all the answers, I've immediately caused a trust barrier here. Whereas if I am sitting having a very personal conversation with you about what it is you are experiencing right now and how I can help you get to the other side of that, you end up in a position where there's a lot more trust in the process. And so again, these organizations had very specific objectives that they had outlined of like, these are the things I am struggling with right now. These are the locations in my community that need the most help. which led to a series of actionable programming steps. We could identify places in the community where these things could be done. We could identify the owners of those properties. We can identify funding sources associated with those projects so that they can be implementable, that ultimately result in a vision that the entire community can get around. And this is obviously extremely small in scale compared to what we're talking about here, but nonetheless, the process is still the same. If I can draw an exact line of the bit of information that you told me at the first public meeting all the way through to this last vision that we are ready to implement and we have exact funding sources outlined for, then we have given you what we can, but you ultimately are empowered with the tools necessary to make it possible to make your community more resilient in the future and take ownership over it. That was a lot of stuff. So
That was great, Bethany. And
That was
Tucker, I see-
awesome, Bethany.
Yeah, I see your hand, Tucker, and I just want to add a little context here because this piece of ownership is not just a nice to have, it seems to me. Listening to Laura and Steve, the ownership by the community is really critical. For Steve's project, that, you mentioned quickly that that's going to end up in some kind of a funding mechanism. That may have to go to a vote by the community. And so having community buy-in for the vision is going to be critical. And for Laura's project, that's going to end up in code changes within city governments, which community participation in those planning meetings and in those city council meetings is going to be critical to actually drive that change. So I think that's definitely really created something really important here. And you put your finger on why I think this conversation is so important, because yes, we have these great, dual visioning projects going along the Greenway and along 99, but we are kind of missing some of that uplift, that tidal uplift of community involvement, and this could be a very, very important aspect of that. Tucker, what would you like to add? And then I want to move on to Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, for just contextualizing that in our localized environment. I appreciate that. And Bethany, that's just, it's so great to hear. I mean, the Paradise Plan specifically has just been lauded as a really, community recovery plan that was really co-created by the community rather than handed down. And I think it's just had a lot of rewards to that approach. And so if you're able to, I know that you kind of downloaded a lot, but some of the highest level learnings that maybe we could take away here for our valley is sort of best practices for some of these larger planning initiatives. And then just real quick, I saw a couple kind of words in there that just want to make me ask, did you use social pinpoint in some point in this thing? So I saw the online idea wall and the interactive online mapping. And I just want to mention, if you did, that's one of the things that we're going to be purchasing and hoping to be making available to the jurisdictions and other people that are at this table talking about their individual recovery plans as a tool.
it is an excellent resource. So I have spent the last year and a half rethinking engagement in an online environment, because believe me, one of my favorite things about being in Paradise was hugging those residents in person at every open house and every public meeting that we had. And you create a very intimate relationship with those people as you're working with them. And unfortunately, for better or worse, the pandemic has created an environment where we have to rethink that entire toolkit. And so I can speak very highly to our use of Social Pinpoint over the last year and a half, and what we've been able to both co-create with their team to try and improve those tools to make them the most effective, and how we've been able to capitalize that on a resource that's really attainable to the public as well. There are a lot of online user interfaces that make it very difficult to engage in a virtual environment. And those are extremely easy and accessible tools to participate in, knowing full well that we have also had to supplement those things with paper surveys and flyers out in the community and everything else to bridge the digital divide, which is something that becomes extremely critical to recognize, especially in disaster-prone environments where, in the case of Paradise, there was an immediate issue around the difficulty accessing internet associated with all of the downed utilities and things that people were living amidst. And so every community has some sort of digital divide issue. And so just making sure that that's met while still being able to utilize such powerful tools like Social Pinpoint So believe me, if you ever have any questions, I could talk about Social Pinpoint for a long time. But I do think one high level takeaway from all of this, and something that I would just encourage as you move forward looking at how to run this type of effort or bring all of these efforts together, is that the idea of ownership and buy-in over these processes means that everyone with decision-making power has to be at the table. So if this is a process that's held by the long-term recovery group, if this is a process that's held by the municipalities, this is something that your mayors, your town councils, those folks that have that ability to make and implement decisions have to be present, as much so as all of the community members have to be present at the conversation, because you have to empower those local leaders to believe in their capacity to also implement this as well. And so, you know, the process in Paradise was operated by the town while being co-created by the community, in the same way, you know, the visioning plan for Southwest Louisiana is being co-created by the community, and it's actually being held by the Community Foundation. But at every step of the way, while the Community Foundation is the one putting forth the dollars and the manpower to support this effort taking place, the mayor of Lake Charles is in an every other week meeting at this point to support the project, or all of the parish administrators and police jury individuals at Calcasieu and Cameron are participating at every step of the way as well, because ultimately they're going to pull out pieces of this and say, okay, time to implement this one. In the same way that the town of Paradise is like, all right, recovery project 35, time for me to pull this one and implement it now. And so these two voices have to be balanced. These two groups of people have to be present at the same time, because it means that that local leadership can hear what's going on, and they also can take it directly into implementation. And sometimes that means that they are reacting as well off of what is happening and what the public perspective is. I mean, one of the most frustrating things initially in Paradise is that we had 21 building standards on what it would take to build back safely in a community that is so prone to fire disaster. However, about 50% of those standards felt too unattainable to the general public because of finances and access to resources. And town council is like, we can't do that. We can't get behind supporting all 21 building standards initially, knowing that our population can't get there right now. But they have now revisited several of those over the last 2.5 years and started plugging in new ones each time they can rally additional support. And so the good and the bad together, bringing it all to the table and not shutting any of it out from the process, means that you can always revisit those things as well.
That's great. Thank you, Bethany. The voice of experience there. The way we think about it here is that experts and advocates need to be talking together so that what the ideas are executable. And so, Bob, I would love to turn to you and kind of bring in the note of tourism and economic development and how this might all relate.
Yeah, I thank you for that, Stephen. Thank you, Bethany, and everybody. I'm just bringing up something. Travel Oregon, their mission and vision statements, and before we sort of go into what that is, I think what's super clear is that all the stuff that Bethany and the other folks are working on the actual project on the ground right now. The visitor economy is sort of outside of that circle. It's almost a second circle that's engaged, and but what you'll see here is you'll see a surprising amount of connection with the Oregon visitor economy, Oregon tourism, and the needs of communities. And when tourism is working well, it's working well for communities. And I just put this out here. This is the vision statement for Travel Oregon, for the state: a better life for all Oregonians through strong, sustainable local communities that welcome a diversity of explorers. And the mission, inspiring travel that drives community enhancement and economic development. And so that's pretty straightforward. That's been true for a while. Travel Oregon is engaged in a transformational strategy, and I'm putting up a draft of that just came out last week. And you'll see that now in 2022, the tourism community is engaging much more on climate action plans, on equity outcomes, on the needs of residents. And you'll see, now the mission that we just read before, it's proposed to morph a little bit, create statewide equity, stewardship, well-being alongside our stakeholders by optimizing visitation, investing in communities, strengthening the resiliency of the tourism industry. So I think a lot of the things in this project pop right in that mission. So I share that just so that you all, see that there are these larger state agencies that in many ways are connected to the work that you're engaged in, and that a successful project here will be supported and fostered down the road in the long term by the visitor economy and the tourism industry as well. I think it's important, and I put this in sort of just as an input for consideration with the groups going forward in discussions, but these ideas of these core values, integrity, equity, community stewardship, two major pieces of that, equity outcomes. And I think the outdoor recreation sector in particular is one in which racial equity outcomes are a conversation that's actively going on. And something like the Greenway is a very potent and possibly significant invitation to broaden the engagement both of visitors and residents about who participates in outdoor recreation, and having sort of an urban access to this kind of asset. And in our world, we call them just destination assets. And it is a destination asset in my world, but in our world, and I live in Talent, it's just where we live. But inviting both groups of those people, visitors and residents, to engage in outdoor recreation for well-being, which you also saw pop up in that language, and sort of just the recreational opportunity in and of itself is something that's very much in line with where we are going as the tourism industry. The second piece in that stewardship, you'll see resiliency, regenerative future. You will start to see many tourism organizations have climate action plans. It's just where it's going, and the impact of travel on climate and resiliency. And non-motorized recreation is obviously a key piece of that, those climate action plans. So the work on the Greenway for a variety of visitors in Medford, ideally up to Grants Pass, eventually Ashland. And when we think down the road of how does the visitor economy capitalize or work with this kind of destination asset. And I just think, just picture 10 years down the road, there are bike trails, bike routes through Rogue Valley wine country, and visitors in Ashland and Medford access the wine country and Talent and Phoenix and various parts of Medford via the Greenway. And then there's signs that the Talent wine route, here you go. Those kinds of large scale projects that are conforming to all of these values are where we're going as an industry right now, particularly me at the regional destination management level. We are less about just pure promotion in this old school way, like just get a bazillion people to come and we'll make a ton of money and call it good. That's not really what we're about. Certainly at the state and the regional levels. DMOs, local DMOs, they have an obligation to their cities and an agreement with them. And of course we want to drive economic impact. But I'm just sharing with you some of these secondary goals that are very potent points of connection with this Greenway project in the tourism world. And I am here and available as you all wish me to be available, and certainly on the funding stream downstream. I don't think tourism will come in on sort of the, the bricks and asphalt kind of thing. But when you start getting to signage or anything that's visitor facing, particularly if it's bilingual, I think that there's a very high likelihood of success from the tourism angle on getting grants for that kind of visitor experience that is, again, hitting all of these points that are part of the mission and core values of the tourism industry in Oregon. And so that's what I have to say.
That's great, Bob. Thank you. It's so interesting to me that there is this virtuous cycle, that can develop around if the Greenway is used for transportation of both residents and tourists, then you have more eyes on the street, right? It creates equity because it makes getting to work more affordable for many people. But you don't have to own a car anymore to work in Ashland if you live in Talent. And the more eyes on the street, it serves that policing aspect as well, right? The more people who are using the Greenway, the fewer people who feel comfortable possibly camping out or doing other things that are not kind of in the accepted set of activities. So thank you, Bob. That's great. And I think that it'll be interesting to see how in the public commenting in these advisory committees, et cetera, we can work in some of the stakeholders from, representatives from your industry who can speak for visitors. So
on that note, I think it's important to also note, Stephen, that kind of what Bob was mentioning, we have a very large destination that the city of Medford has with US Cellular Park, or now I believe it's Lithia Fields or some different sponsor. But anyways, that facility that people come from all over the West Coast for, and the Greenway runs right through it. We have an RV park that we recently constructed up by the Expo, and the Expo itself is a big draw for out of town folks. So that path that goes through all of these different facilities, in addition to the breweries and wineries and everything else we have around here, does connect a lot of tourism type facilities that draw people here. And we see folks camping at the RV park up there in Central Point all the time that are coming, from British Columbia on their way down to Arizona. They stop, they hop on the bike path and ride into Ashland, et cetera. So I appreciate Bob bringing up the topic of out of town impacts from the Greenway as well, because it is a state recreational trail that was designated that by Oregon State Parks at our request, and it is a draw for out of town use.
that's great. There's another group who's not here. I haven't seen them, but is the mountain bike and other bicycling groups, right? Who may be really great allies, because the mountain bike groups are developing whole tracks for beginners down in Ashland that are near the bike trail. And you could start developing some other kind of mountain bike practice places and that sort of thing, because they're already a great source of tourism into the valley. So that's great. Karen, would you like to talk about the community recovery plan and your vision, how that might work?
So I think for me, the way I've been thinking about it is sort of, it functions as the connective tissue between all of these plans and sort of takes it out a further level. Because I know, based on what we've reviewed from the Paradise Community Recovery Plan, like they were in a much different position when they did theirs, because they were months out of their disaster and we're now a year and a half later. So a lot of these planning efforts have gotten underway. And so the question is, how do we bridge them? And then how do we amplify them and grow them in a way that gets our survivors back home and makes it a destination, right? For folks that want to live here, and for folks that want to continue to stay here, because we know that the landscape is changing. And so I'm excited about all the planning efforts that are underway, and I want to know, how do we support them as part of the community recovery planning process, as opposed to being another thing that's detracting attention. So I love this idea of a calendar so that we can coordinate some efforts and make sure that we are moving these planning efforts forward in a way that engages as many community members as possible. So Tucker is going to join the community recovery planning team.
Well, and I also just feel like it's important to kind of also frame all this within sort of the CDBGR effort as well. There's polygons within polygons within polygons. And So, you know, I know Alex has a lot to say about that whenever he's available to talk. And yeah, I just think it's, you know, it's important to gather sort of lowest common denominator answers to questions, but also make sure that the stuff that we're gathering or can be gathered in the process of creating these plans is valuable to as many projects as possible, and at the same time doesn't overwhelm people with survey fatigue. So that's an important piece I'd like to just bring up.
Yeah, and so Bethany and I had a conversation earlier today, and there is a possibility that UDA will be coming back here mid-March. And so looking at maybe rescoping a proposal that was floated last year to see what it might look like now. And I would love to have Bob, Steve, and Laura involved in that, to sort of think about how the scope that's built out for the community recovery plan would best complement the efforts that you guys have underway right now.
Laura, I see your hand is up, and I have a question I want to address to you and to Steve that's related to what Karen just said, and that is the public input raw data that you collect is that public record, and is it possible to share that, and maybe LTRG and UDA could kind of synthesize some of that into the larger plan as well?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. From our perspective, any of the work that the contractor is doing under contract for us becomes county ownership, which by default makes it public record. So any of the information that we're getting, I see no reason why we would not share that with other partners, with other projects moving along as well.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I understand the coordination of meetings might be hard, but we at least could pour the data into one synthesis process possibly. Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, so, there might be input that some of our local jurisdiction partners receive, and I don't know, how that would be packaged, for public consumption, but certainly every meeting and event that we have has to have a summary. And those are just part of the project deliverables, that can be available. They're often included actually as attachments to final plans. So all of that should be available. And that's an area where we can look at, in the public involvement plan, making sure that, for example, it's stipulated that those things are posted on the website, perhaps. So although, we'll have to look at, sometimes there's a little bit of, sometimes it can be a little sensitive when you're tying, a member of the public, their name to a comment that they didn't expect to be, broadcast on a website. So we can look at some of that. But yeah, that should all be public. Did I answer your question? Okay, so I had a question actually about, I think one person suggested, and then Karen just seconded, unless Karen, you were the first person who suggested it, I can't remember, this idea of having a calendar where everything is sort of shown so people can get a sense of which project is which and what the opportunities are for each project. I think that's a great idea. For my project, we're not at the point where we can be setting dates, but I started thinking about, okay, where would such a thing live? And when we start, that's something that would have to be continually updated, because for certain items, once we kick off, I might know generally what month it might happen, but I wouldn't know the day. And all those timeframes get tightened as the closer you get to them until they get set. And so it would be helpful if somebody was sort of the owner of such a calendar, and then we could submit our changes to that person, or even, if it was an online thing, maybe have an account. I don't know how it would work, but I guess maybe I jumped ahead a little bit too much, but I started wondering, like, who would manage that?
Well, and it sounds to me almost like there's like everything we're talking about is that there's a really rich opportunity here for maybe some like collaboration, and there might need to be some like check-ins around where we can coordinate stuff. But the LTRG can absolutely host that kind of a calendar and figure out how we plug people in. And then Kathy had suggested potentially contracting with UDA to do the engagement piece for these efforts. So that would supplement your guys' efforts and potentially expand what we have to look forward into the community recovery plan. And so I have some funding that can like sort of lean in that direction, but I think it's something that we might want to explore. It could be an interesting opportunity.
And maybe just a quick note on hosting a calendar like that as a lesson learned from our experience in Paradise is my role as a community engagement director means that I have become an amateur public relations and media person. However, very strategically, the town of Paradise hired a communications firm to help manage those things and now has continued so they manage a website that we started as a part of our engagement process through Squarespace that had updates about the engagement around the long-term recovery effort, but that website has now become a host of resources associated with how do I rebuild my home and where do I go for permitting, and I'm experiencing this issue, who can I contact, and who's the contact at the Paradise Irrigation District that can help me with water, you name it. It's become the catch-all for all of those resources that communications team is still managing, and as well, Paradise is hosting quarterly community meetings, and the communications team is putting out all of the information about when those are taking place and what the content of those meetings are, and managing the long lists of emails and phone numbers to contact folks to get them engaged. And so sometimes it can help if the funding is placed and accessible to do something like that. Those are folks that can kind of think about just that piece of the process while everyone else is very deep in the weeds of a lot of other pieces of the recovery effort. And it really helps to keep the communication clear and consistent as well.
Yeah.
Great.
To the comment of UDA doing the public outreach, I think there's some opportunity there to explore additional public outreach, kind of pushing it out there, the information. Just keep in mind that I'm sure Laura is in the same boat that I'm in. I'm under contract with a firm who has a public relations firm, who has a communications team, subcontractor to do all of that work. So I can't necessarily step on their toes. But that being said, if we want to engage further and above and beyond kind of the scope of our projects, I think that there's some definite room to talk there for sure. And we would appreciate the help.
Yeah, it might be interesting. There might be some interesting opportunities to go beyond the scope of the project that you have scoped and use UDA or some other firm to, collect a little bit more and then feed that back into your processes as well, right? So
yeah,
I think there's an interesting collaboration. Karen, I think you're probably the lead to kind of set that meeting, you or me, right, to set that meeting and continue this conversation to say, how do we practically do it? And Laura, I love that you're the one who says, well, how do we make this actually work in a calendar? Because no wonder you're the project manager who drills it all down and makes it all happen. So this has been a really interesting conversation and really great. I think there's a lot of interesting collaboration potential here. What I'd like to do, because I looked over the agenda and we've touched on all kinds of different pieces of what was on the agenda as is usual. You kind of set out the fence posts and everybody wanders around inside them. But one thing we haven't talked too much about, Bethany has a little bit, is what are the challenges that we're going to face in reaching all the corners of our community? And how might we address this? What should we be watching out for, and how do we get ahead of that a little bit? So whether that's on your project that you've got now or just something that you've seen in the past that has been a challenge in terms of that inclusion and equity piece. So Laura, your hand's up. Why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I find generally that the challenge, and Bethany did talk about this, is people's time. time and attention, I would say, but mostly time. And since the projects that I work on are always amending cities and sometimes counties' zoning codes, you can imagine that when we try to get people involved, we're asking a lot of them in order, because these are complicated documents. And it's difficult sometimes. You know, visioning can be fun and great. You can do a lot of drawings and things like that. But when you get down into code, development code, it can be very difficult. So I liked that Bethany had that example where people, you know, if they only have 5 minutes, they can text or something like that. And I think, at least for my projects, we need to do a better job of finding ways for people to be engaged at a range of time commitment levels. And sometimes it just might not be possible when you're talking about a detailed zoning code, that, you know, if somebody's going to be engaged in the process, they have to digest that information, and there's just no way around it. But that said, there's still a lot of things that we could do, I think, to try to make it more digestible and let people give input in snippets if that's all they have time for, and then in more in depth if that's what they have time for, and then taking all of that input equally, you know, and not just giving more weight to the retired person who had hours and hours to give. Anyway, so that's my challenge, I think.
I think for our project, Stephen, I think the challenge is the Greenway. I don't want to use the word polarizing, but the Greenway right now has very strong feelings from different members of the community based off of their different feelings, whether it be houselessness, fires, folks who recently lost their house, you know, adjacent to the Greenway, et cetera. So you know, I don't think necessarily getting input from a subset of the community is going to be difficult. I think folks have very strong opinions on the Greenway, and they really want to share those opinions. So they're going to be doing that. But I think that that's a fairly small subset of Jackson County. So reaching those people in the middle who maybe don't feel so strongly about the Greenway for one reason or another, maybe have never used the Greenway, have driven by it for years and just wondered what the heck it was. So reaching that larger subset of county residents and trying to get them involved in the process, trying to get their opinions, and frankly, trying to get them out on the Greenway, a certain amount of them, so that they can experience it the way it is currently, so that they can provide their opinions. I think it's going to be challenging for us for sure.
That's great. Thank you, Steve. Go ahead, Tucker.
I just had a quick, you know, to Steve's point, I wanted to ask Bethany, did in any of the recovery sort of planning work that you've done, did you ever try to incentivize participations, and if so, what worked?
Sure. Yeah, we've used, we've done gift cards, we've offered food at public meetings. We've done, you know, a handful of kind of those normalized methods for incentivizing engagement. Hands down, usually offering food at a public meeting when it is around dinner time-ish will just naturally bring people around, because they're like, great, free food, that's fine with me. I'll sit and listen to you talk for a half hour and give you a comment or two, as one of the most successful things. But I think to push back a little bit on incentivizing with things like food or monetary or whatever it may be, I think incentivizing with a reason to show up is just as important. And this comes back to, after you've identified your barriers of engagement and kind of how you need to meet needs. So sometimes, you know, you can incentivize moms to show up to a meeting if you offer childcare, or you can incentivize families with kids to show up if their kids are allowed in the room, and there's pizza for them to eat, or, you know, a bottle of water or whatever else. So those incentives are not just about convincing people to participate. It's also recognizing that there might be a reason why they can't participate. And now I am coming at you with something that will help support your participation. But just as important is recognizing, one, there are always going to be people who don't show up, and you have to accept that as normal and fine. We use anywhere from 1% to 5% of a population participating in a project is a marker for success, which really doesn't seem like a lot. And so if the numbers are potentially smaller than anticipated, sometimes that's normal. But two, incentivizing people with a reason to be there comes from establishing a set of clear objectives for what you hope that engagement to achieve, and understanding the limitations of public input and how it will affect your project. So does someone actually get to have an input on what the code is specifically going to say? That is for the process to decide. If you come into this meeting and I give you a bunch of expectations and be like, this is everything your community feedback is going to do, and you have 100% of the power, and then I don't meet that expectation, I've lost trust with you, and now you have no reason to show up. And so sometimes that incentive can be purely in trust building. And for Paradise, that meant we spent most of our first meeting with the public listening to their fire stories, listening to they called them their campfire stories. And that meant a lot of tears shed, a lot of hugs, a lot of just sitting quietly. And by breaking down the barriers and allowing people to discuss some of the most intimate things that they're experiencing, that was one way of them believing that we were people they could trust. And that meant they showed back up. That meant that there were people running around the room trying to find any member of our team who they recognized that they had had a conversation with previously, because they had built trust with that person. And so if you don't forefront the necessity to build that trust, then your participation is going to be lower as well. So, again, I think you can absolutely incentivize with things like food and childcare at public meetings. And some of those are necessities. They're not just incentives, but it is equally important that the process has trust building as an incentive for people to want to come back. In Paradise, we saw several people coming back over and over and over again and looking for us specifically by name and waiting to half hour, 45 minutes after a meeting is over so that they could specifically talk to my boss about this one thing that they had brought up with him previously, and they now had more information to offer. And so sometimes that is equally, if not more important.
That's great. Thank you, Bethany. I think it's, this is an interesting potential role for the LTRG and all the community groups that our groups represent, to help to build that trust and to communicate how inputs will be taken into account in the various projects. And so maybe that goes alongside the calendar, where we can start building some content that will help people understand both the opportunity and the limitations of their inputs. No, we're not going to put a Ferris wheel, on the Greenway, right? But anyway, so maybe that's something that we can take on. We just have a couple more minutes, but I think that there's a very interesting opportunity here for the LTRG to start creating this kind of connective tissue, I think you called it, Karen, around these two very important and really interestingly formulated projects that Steve and Laura are managing. But yeah, I think this is an interesting opportunity. Any closing comments from any of the panelists, or closing question for anybody in the group?
I think about, right, like if we go it alone, we'll get there faster. If we do it together, we'll get there slower, but we'll get there better. We'll go further. And I think that we have a really unique opportunity here. And I think Steve Lambert is acutely aware of my ability to, turn terrible things into great outcomes. So I think we have a great opportunity ahead of us, and I look forward to partnering with all of you.
For a little bit of history's sake, when I was kind of leading the evacuation center efforts at the expo, Karen was on our team. So I just want to put a little context to that.
Yeah, Steve had to try to keep me in check.
And vice versa.
It was a good team. So.
Well, great. Anything else before we go? I will just say thank you to everybody. I know everybody here does a tremendous amount to move this community forward. And, you know, it's really great to see kind of some of these efforts overlapping here and the potential to really figure out how to coordinate. So we will capture notes, you know, and put out the video of the meeting and make this available across the community. Yeah, and then I think we can take on this work of pulling together this calendar and some of the content that will help people understand what the difference that their input will make. So thank you, one
Stephen.
and all.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Good evening.